Hey there, and welcome to the Dozy Historian. If you love stories from the past, told in a calm and cozy way, you're in just the right place. Tonight, we're journeying back to the dawn of American expansion, exploring the powerful ideas and pivotal moments that reshaped the continent. Our story begins in 1845 in the bustling, smoke-filled offices of the Democratic Review in Washington, D.C. The air is thick with ambition. Here, a phrase is born, one that will justify the conquest of 1,000,000 square miles. And echo through history, manifest destiny. Senator Elias Thorne, a man whose wealth comes from Boston's shipping lanes, not the rugged frontier, stares at the freshly inked words. He sees not just a political slogan, but a divine command. He turns to the editor, John O'Sullivan. "Make it a trumpet call," he urges. "Make them see what we see?" O'Sullivan is nervous. Manifest destiny? It sounds less like a political mandate and more like scripture. "Exactly," Thorne replies with a chilling smile. "Politics is haggling over tariffs. Destiny is the will of the Almighty. We are not merely taking land, we are redeeming it, from sea to shining sea." That night, the phrase goes to press. It's a spark in dry tinder. Suddenly, expansion isn't aggression. It's a holy mission. The idea gives men a divine absolution to reconcile their greed with their ideals. It's the perfect justification for an empire. Hundreds of miles west, this ideology finds its instrument in Captain Jedediah Yet Holt. A man forged by the trail, Yet is a surveyor and scout hired by Senator Thorne's Western Land Company. His job is to map routes and pacify local populations, a sterile term for brutal conquest. He sits by a fire in the Rockies, sketching a map in the dirt. Beside him is Tocohota, a Cheyenne woman he calls Little Dove, his guide. He sees her as a convert to his American way. "See here, Dove," Yet whispers, tracing a line west. "This is wilderness, savagery. We bring order. We bring the plow and the word of God. This land needs the Republic. It needs us." But Tocohota is silent. She doesn't see a wilderness to be tamed. She sees her ancestral home, the graves of her people. She understands that Yet's God is a God of taking, and his destiny is the funeral pyre of her world. The news of America's ambition, fueled by manifest destiny, reaches Governor Rafael Ortega in Santa Fe, a proud, cultured man representing the tenuous Mexican grip on its northern territories. He sees the hypocrisy clearly. A nation founded on escaping empire now seeks to build the grandest one of all, justified by God. He knows the fight won't be won with armies, but in a battle of faith, his people's faith against the new, unshakable faith of the Americans. Let's rewind a few decades to another pivotal moment, the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. While Lewis and Clark were charting the vast, unknown territory, the real immediate impact was felt in the sweltering port of New Orleans. The transfer of flags from France to the United States was swift, but the transfer of economic power was even more efficient. The purchase wasn't just about land. It was about securing the Mississippi River for American commerce, cementing the future of the Deep South's most powerful institution, the Empire of Cotton. Paul Dubois, a wealthy French Creole planter, watches American-flagged ships being loaded with cotton. He had been suspicious of the Americans, but now sees an opportunity. He approaches the new American governor, Claiborne. "Governor," Dubois begins, "we welcome the stability your republic promises. But let us discuss terms. Under the Spanish and French, our property had certain definitions. How does the American Constitution view our peculiar necessity?" Claiborne, sweating in the humidity, is evasive. "The laws are under review, Mr. Dubois, but the economic viability of this region is paramount. Congress understands that the sugar and cotton cultivation rests on chattel labor." "Chattel indeed," Dubois confirms, his eyes hardening. "This land is rich, but it requires a constant, unquestioning supply of labor. The $15 million your president paid was just the title deed. The true price is paid here daily, in the flesh of those who cultivate the land. His argument is brutally simple. The Louisiana Purchase created millions of acres of fertile land, creating an overwhelming demand for enslaved people. It instantly made the domestic slave trade one of the most profitable industries in the nation, guaranteeing its survival. I only ask, Du Bois concludes, that the American legal system recognize my right to my property. Do not confuse your talk of liberty with our requirements for wealth. In this delta, wealth always dictates the terms. Governor Claiborne knows the grim truth. Jefferson's philosophical empire of liberty is incompatible with the economic reality of the new territory. He signs a decree that strips away the few protections previously afforded to the enslaved, making them property in the fullest American sense. The bargain struck in Paris has come due in the cotton fields. Meanwhile, on the Missouri River, the Lewis and Clark expedition is deep in Mandan territory. Their French-Canadian guide, Etienne Charbonneau, has been fighting a secret war. He has exaggerated dangers, misnoted river crossings, and altered maps, all to protect the native lands. But the American efficiency is relentless. One afternoon, Lewis catches Etienne scratching out a trail marker on a new map, a trail that would have led settlers directly to a sacred Mandan farming area. "Charbonneau, what are you doing?" Lewis roars. Etienne doesn't flinch. "I am saving the land, Captain. You buy it with money." "I tried to buy it back with ink. You do not bring liberty. You bring a death warrant wrapped in a deed." Lewis, furious, accuses him of treason. Etienne simply nods. "Treason to a deed of sale, yes, but loyalty to the river. You see the land as a vacuum, waiting for your fences. I see it as a home, already full. The price of your purchase is the destruction of that home." Lewis is paralyzed by the unbridgeable moral chasm between them. He had been so focused on the geographic triumph that he had ignored its human cost. In the end, manifest destiny marches on. In Santa Fe, Yet Holt's company arrives. He and Governor Ortega confront each other, not about land, but about the nature of civilization and God's will. The Mexican flag is lowered, but Yet's victory is hollow. His brutal pacification drives Tocajota to an act of quiet resistance. She sabotages a critical supply line, causing his mission to collapse from within. He is left with the ruins of his mission and his belief system. Years later, Senator Thorne is celebrated in Congress for the triumph of Providence. He is immensely wealthy. Yet Holt becomes a broken man, haunted by the atrocities he committed, his divine justification revealed as a terrible lie. Tocajota vanishes, her resistance a quiet truth beneath the grand narrative of empire. The Louisiana Purchase is hailed as the greatest bargain in history, but its price was not $15 million. It was a vast, enduring debt of blood, displacement, and hypocrisy. The ideals of an empire of liberty were built upon the expansion of slavery and the destruction of native homes, a contradiction that would define and divide the continent for centuries to come. Thank you for joining me here at the Dozy Historian. I hope you found this journey into the past both interesting and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed our story tonight, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. Until next time, sleep well. In the summer of 1804, months into their monumental journey, the Corps of Discovery was locked in a brutal contest, not just with the uncharted wilderness, but with the Missouri River itself. This wasn't the serene waterway from Eastern pamphlets. It was a furious, living entity, constantly collapsing its own banks and spitting out snags that could tear a boat's hull to shreds. Leading this struggle was Captain William Clark. With his immense physical presence, he was the undisputed master of the river. He shouted commands, pulled ropes alongside his men, and nursed the blisters and sunstroke that plagued the crew. For Clark, survival was primary. The map was secondary. His partner, Captain Meriwether Lewis, was the opposite. He was obsessed with precision. Every day, rain or shine, he'd insist on stopping to take latitude readings, to press his botanical samples, and to record temperatures with his finicky instruments. He believed the chaos of the wilderness must yield to the laws of mathematics. This conflict between chaos and order came to a head in late summer. Lewis had meticulously charted the river's course. He was confident a large, slow bend ahead would give them smooth passage. "We follow the meridian, Clark," Lewis declared, tapping his compass. "My reading shows the deepest channel hugging the west bank here." Clark scowled, his eyes fixed on the water, not the instruments. "Your meridian says west, Meriwether, but my gut says otherwise. The river's talking. It's too quiet over there." A sandbar's building up. They followed Lewis's scientific map. Within the hour, the lead boat lurched violently and ground to a sudden, sickening halt, stuck fast on a treacherous, submerged sandbar. The men strained, pushing against the heavy keelboat as it began taking on water. Panicked, the constant shadow of the expedition reared its head. It was Sacagawea, sitting quietly in the second boat, holding her newborn son, who broke the tension. She didn't speak. She just pointed, not at the river, but at the cottonwood trees on the eastern bank. Their leaves were visibly vibrating despite the still air. Her husband translated her simple observation. She says, "The land is pushing the water. The trees tell her the soil is giving way on the east side, meaning the channel must be carving deep against that bank. The bar is a trap." Clark understood instantly. Her map wasn't on paper. It was an intuitive synthesis of geology, botany, and hydrology, knowledge passed down through generations. Portage the supplies to the east bank. "Now," Clark roared, overruling Lewis's frantic attempts to consult his charts. It took hours of backbreaking labor, but they freed the boat, losing precious supplies, including Lewis's irreplaceable thermometer. That night, as the men collapsed in exhaustion, Lewis sat by the fire, his face grim. The loss of the thermometer was a physical blow, but the failure of his reason was a greater defeat. The pride of the Enlightenment had nearly wrecked them. The unwritten knowledge of a young Shoshone woman had saved them. He found Clark sketching in his journal. Clark was meticulously noting the position of the sandbar, the type of vibration in the cottonwoods, and the date integrating Sacagawea's knowledge into the new American map. "She knows the wilderness in a way we never will, William," Lewis admitted, the words tasting like defeat. Clark looked up. "She doesn't map the river with numbers, Meriwether. She maps it with survival. That's the kind of certainty we need." He pointed to a small new notation on his map, marking the sandbar not with coordinates, but with a warning. "Here, trust the trees." The expedition had begun by charting the wilderness. Now, the wilderness, through Sacagawea, was charting them. This clash of worldviews, the paper map versus the living land, would define the American frontier for decades to come. Just a few years later, in 1810, this conflict would erupt again, not on a wild river, but inside a cramped warehouse on the edge of Fort Wayne. The air stank of stale tobacco and cheap whiskey. This was not a diplomatic gathering. It was a coercive assembly. On one side sat Governor William Henry Harrison, impeccably uniformed, his gaze sharp with ambition. He was surrounded by his agents and surveyors, orchestrating the latest act of American expansion. On the other side sat a collection of aging minor chiefs from the Miami and Delaware nations, men worn down by decades of skirmishes and dwindling resources. Elijah Stone, a mixed-race scout, stood near the table, his role agonizingly clear: to translate the intricate legal language of the deed of cession into the fluid spiritual language of the indigenous groups. He felt every word turn to ash in his mouth. Harrison began with paternalistic warmth. "The president offers you security," he declared, "and a fair price for lands you no longer actively hunt. All we ask is that you formalize the frontier line." Elijah translated, but he knew the words were a lie. When he said, "The sale is final," he knew the chiefs heard a temporary lease. But the American document meant permanent transfer, the elimination of their sovereignty over millions of acres. One elder chief, his face a mask of weary defeat, raised a trembling hand. "Tell the governor that the land belongs to the people, not the chiefs. We cannot sell the bone from our mother's body. The young men will not respect this paper." Harrison waved it away with a practiced smile. A minor dispute, settled by the payment. He pushed the deed forward, along with bags of silver coins and a large barrel of whiskey. As the first chief dipped his finger into the ink, the warehouse door slammed open. Tecumseh stood framed in the doorway. He was alone, but his presence filled the room with the force of 1,000 warriors. He had ridden 2 days without rest. He walked to the table, and with a sweep of his hand, knocked the silver coins onto the dusty floor. They rang out like scattered gunfire. "You call this a treaty?" Tecumseh's voice was a low, vibrating thunder. "You offer a trinket price for the heart of the world. Tell him, Elijah Stone." Elijah, trembling, translated. "He says that the Great Spirit gave the land to all his children. No single man has the right to sell what belongs to the children of the future." Tecumseh pointed directly at Harrison, his eyes blazing. "You negotiate with the weak and the drunken. You steal by paperwork what you are afraid to take by force. I tell you now, Governor Harrison, this frontier line you draw is nothing. It is written on a piece of paper that will rot. The true line is drawn in the hearts of my people, and if you cross it, you will meet the only price we recognize: war." Harrison, though outwardly composed, was visibly rattled. He ordered Tecumseh removed, but the damage was done. The chiefs who hadn't signed retracted their consent, their temporary weakness overridden by Tecumseh's moral authority. The neat lines on Harrison's map, once symbols of order and progress, now seemed like lines drawn in the sand before an approaching storm. The conflict was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a promise, delivered by a prophet who, like Sacagawea, understood a map not made of paper, but of survival, spirit, and the unshakable connection to the land itself. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more chapters from history. We'll see you next time. The legal battle for the Cherokee Nation wasn't fought with rifles and war cries. It was waged in the marble halls of the U.S. Supreme Court, with Latin phrases and constitutional arguments, the very tools of the civilization the Cherokee had so carefully adopted. Elias Starr, a prominent Cherokee, stood in that Washington, D.C. courtroom. His presence alone was a living argument against the state of Georgia. He was there to assist the nation's attorney, arguing that Georgia had no right to extend its laws over the sovereign Cherokee, a nation recognized by multiple federal treaties. Elias had staked his entire identity on this moment. He believed in the supremacy of law. If the American system truly valued justice over greed, then this court, the highest expression of American civilization, would protect them. But Georgia openly defied the court. Its governor declared that the federal government couldn't interfere with state policy regarding domestic populations. His agents even harassed and imprisoned white missionaries who were sympathetic to the Cherokee, including Samuel Worcester, whose case was the basis for this legal challenge. Then, on March 3, 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall delivered the court's opinion in Worcester v. Georgia. The victory was profound. Marshall's ruling affirmed that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community and that Georgia laws had no force within its borders. It was a complete legal vindication of Cherokee sovereignty and their entire strategy of assimilation. News of the verdict arrived in the Cherokee capital, New Echota, like a burst of brilliant sunshine after a long storm. Church bells rang. The Cherokee Phoenix newspaper printed a celebratory extra edition, its headline declaring, "Justice prevails. The law is our shield. Chief John Ross, who had orchestrated the entire effort, stood before the council house, accepting congratulations with weary grace. For a brief, golden moment, it seemed that assimilation had worked. They had fought the white man's greed with the white man's law, and they had won. Elias Starr felt an almost spiritual relief. His faith in the grand, rational design of the Republic was restored. He hurried to his grandmother, Nanyehi, carrying the newspaper, hoping this printed victory would finally convince her that their path was the right one. Nanyehi read the Cherokee headline, then tossed the paper into the fire pit. "The law is only paper, Elias," she said, her voice as dry as burnt leaves. "And fire is coming from the south." The one who truly governs this land did not speak in that room in Washington. Nanye's prophecy was tragically swift. The one who truly governs was President Andrew Jackson, a renowned Indian fighter and a resolute proponent of Indian removal. Upon hearing the Supreme Court's decision, Jackson's fury was legendary. He is famously quoted as having declared, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." This wasn't just political rhetoric. It was a devastating act of constitutional defiance that instantly stripped the Cherokee of their victory. The highest law in the land, the very foundation of the civilized world Elias had pledged allegiance to, was revealed to be optional when it conflicted with political will and the unending appetite for land and gold. Emboldened by Jackson's tacit support, Georgia immediately escalated its attacks. The state declared the Cherokee Nation SS, rights null and void, and moved aggressively to distribute Cherokee lands to white citizens through a lottery. The irony was now complete. Having successfully proven their right to stay through the American legal system, the Cherokee were now being forcibly ejected by a political act that utterly disregarded that system. Elias Starr watched in horror as the state militia seized the printing press of the Cherokee Phoenix. The machine that represented his belief in literacy and law was smashed and hauled away. He felt the cold shock of betrayal. His legal training, his perfect English, his tailored coat, all the trappings of civilization were utterly useless. They had learned the language of the conqueror, only to find the conqueror wasn't listening. "The shield is gone, Chief," Elias confessed to John Ross, his voice hollow. "It was always only parchment." Ross, ever the statesman, replied with stoic despair, "No, Elias, the shield was real, but we failed to account for the savagery of politics. They taught us to fight with logic, but they only respond to force. Our only remaining fight is internal to keep the nation united, even as they dismantle our homes around us." The true limits of assimilation were now brutally clear. It was never a path to equality, but a temporary performance, tolerated only as long as it didn't interfere with the relentless desire for more land. The stage was now set for the final, catastrophic betrayal and the tragic chapter in American history known as the Trail of Tears. Thank you for watching. If you found this history compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories that deserve to be remembered. We'll see you in the next one. Let's talk about the greatest constitutional crisis in early American history. It's a moment when the Supreme Court spoke truth to power, and the President of the United States simply turned his back. This is the story of Worcester v. Georgia *, a landmark legal battle that ended in a tragic, hollow victory. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but in an office in New Echota, the capital of the Cherokee Nation. It's 1831. The air is thick with tension. Georgia is hungry for Cherokee land, especially after gold was discovered there. But Chief John Ross, a man with Scottish heritage and a Cherokee heart, has a radical idea. He knows they can't win with arrows and rifles. So he decides to fight America with its own weapon, the law. "We will fight them in their courts," Ross declared. "If they are a nation of laws, they cannot steal our land." The strategy was brilliant. The Cherokee wouldn't be portrayed as savages resisting progress. They would be a sovereign nation, demanding their rights under treaties signed with the United States government. But to get their case to the Supreme Court, they needed a test case. They needed a white man willing to become a martyr for their cause. And they found him in a quiet missionary from Vermont named Samuel Worcester. Worcester wasn't a politician or a soldier. He was a man of God who had come to the Cherokee Nation to translate the Bible. He loved the people, their language, and their culture. But the state of Georgia saw him as an obstacle. To isolate the Cherokee and remove any outside witnesses, Georgia passed a harsh new law. No white person could live in Cherokee territory without a special license and an oath of allegiance to Georgia. To take the oath meant admitting Georgia's authority over Cherokee land. To refuse meant prison. Worcester knew this was a trap. "They want to sever our connection to you," he told Chief Ross, "so they can do their dark work in the shadows." One humid evening, the Georgia Guard, a rough stake militia, kicked in Worcester's door. "You have no license, preacher," their leader sneered. Worcester stood firm. "I am living in the Cherokee Nation," he said, "under the protection of United States treaties. The laws of Georgia do not extend here." For his defiance, Samuel Worcester was arrested, chained, and sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in a state penitentiary. It was brutal. It was unjust. And it was exactly the legal catalyst John Ross needed. Worcester appealed his conviction, arguing that Georgia had no jurisdiction over him inside the sovereign Cherokee Nation. The case began its slow, momentous journey to Washington, D.C., February 1832. The Supreme Court met in a small, damp chamber in the basement of the Capitol building. The room was packed. Everyone knew this wasn't just about one missionary. This was a showdown between state power and federal authority, with the fate of an entire people hanging in the balance. Representing Worcester and the Cherokee was William Wirt, a brilliant and passionate orator. He stood before the 7 justices, his gaze fixed on the legendary Chief Justice John Marshall. Marshall was old and frail, the last of the founding fathers still in power. He believed deeply in the supremacy of federal law, but he was also a bitter political rival of the sitting president, Andrew Jackson. Wirt's argument was powerful. If the state of Georgia can simply erase a nation protected by federal treaties, he thundered, then the Constitution is a dead letter. The Cherokee are a distinct community. We promised them protection. Shall we now tell the world that our promises are lies? The lawyers for Georgia didn't even bother to show up. Their empty chairs were a silent, arrogant protest against the court's authority. Chief Justice Marshall listened intently, knowing that whichever way he ruled, he was courting disaster. Rule against the Cherokee and betray the law. Rule for them and risk a constitutional war with President Jackson. On March 3, 1832, the courtroom was silent as a tomb. Chief Justice Marshall began to read the court's decision. His voice was weak, but his words were like iron. The Cherokee Nation, he read, is a distinct community in which the laws of Georgia can have no force. He declared Georgia's law unconstitutional and ordered Samuel Worcester to be freed immediately. It was a complete, stunning victory. In the gallery, the Cherokee delegates wept with relief. They had played by the white man's rules, navigated his complex legal system, and won. The highest court in the land had confirmed their sovereignty. The shield of law had held. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. The Supreme Court has no army. It has no power to enforce its own decisions. The ruling landed on the desk of President Andrew Jackson. Jackson was a populist, a frontier soldier who saw Indians as obstacles and judges as elitist snobs. The voters who put him in office wanted that Cherokee land, and he intended to give it to them. Legend has it Jackson sneered. John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Whether he said those exact words doesn't matter. His actions spoke them loud and clear. Jackson did nothing. He didn't send troops to enforce the ruling. He didn't demand Georgia's governor comply. He simply ignored the Supreme Court of the United States. The governor of Georgia laughed at the court order and declared, "Worcester stays in chains." The victory had become a mirage. Samuel Worcester remained in prison, a free man on paper, but a slave in reality. For Chief John Ross, the realization was a crushing blow. The United States was not a nation of laws. It was a nation of power, and the power lay with the men who wanted their land. The Cherokee Nation was left an illegal nightmare sovereign in the eyes of the law, but occupied by an enemy state. The victory in Worcester v. Georgia became a curse. It gave the Cherokee a false hope that prevented them from negotiating a better deal until it was far too late. It also emboldened a small faction of Cherokee, known as the Treaty Party, who realized that if the president could defy the Supreme Court, all hope was lost. They would eventually sign a removal treaty, believing it was the only way to save their people from annihilation. Eventually, Samuel Worcester, realizing his sacrifice was now meaningless, accepted a pardon and left Georgia a broken man. The hollowness of the victory was made brutally clear in 1838, when federal soldiers finally arrived in the Cherokee Nation. They didn't come to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling. They came with rifles and bayonets to force 16,000 Cherokee men, women, and children from their homes. As they were marched west on the Trail of Tears, where 4,000 would die, no one read them their legal rights. The magnificent triumph of justice in a Washington courtroom saved absolutely no one. Worcester v. Georgia stands as one of the most tragic episodes in American history. It was a moment the system worked as designed, protecting a minority from the tyranny of the majority, yet failed completely because one man's political will was stronger than the rule of law. The case is still cited today as a cornerstone of tribal sovereignty, but for the thousands who died on the Trail of Tears, it remains the ultimate hollow victory. Thanks for watching. If you found this story important, please like this video and subscribe for more hidden histories. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're stepping into one of the most heartbreaking chapters of American history, a story of promises broken by force and ink. We're going to explore how treaties, meant to be solemn agreements, became weapons of coercion and bribery, leading to the forced removal of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands. This isn't just about dates and documents. It's about the human cost of a nation's expansion. Let's travel back to the Alabama Territory in the summer of 1831. Imagine being a Creek warrior named Apethel. The air is thick and heavy, but the heat is nothing compared to the pressure you feel. You see smoke rising from your brother's cabin, set ablaze by white squatters who claim your land now belongs to the state. You grip your musket, your heart demanding revenge, but you know it's a trap. If you fight back, the U.S. Army will label your people hostile, and every protection you have will disappear. Your nephew tells you that commissioners from Washington have arrived with a new treaty promising salvation. But you've seen this before. You know they bring ink and whiskey, and they will leave with everything. The treaty grounds are a chaotic scene. U.S. Commissioner General Silas Grant, a man who sees Native Americans as a problem to be solved, sets up his tent. But all around him, a different kind of business is booming. Whiskey peddlers and land speculators circle like vultures, preying on the hungry and desperate. Grant's strategy is simple. We must begin the softening, he tells his aide. Pride is expensive. Hunger and debt are cheap. He identifies chiefs who are in debt to trading houses, men who have been driven to the brink by poor harvests and stolen resources. He doesn't need to win their hearts. He just needs to control their finances. One of these men is Manoah, a legendary warrior. He's facing ruin. Drought has killed his cattle, and traders are calling in their loans. General Grant offers him a way out. In a private meeting, he lays out the terms. The Great Father in Washington is benevolent, he says. He wishes to relieve you of this burden. Grant presents a treaty that promises to pay off all the chief's debts. Not just that, there will be private payments, sacks of silver coins, for their wisdom in guiding their people. Manoah looks at Grant, his eyes haunted. "You ask me to sell the graves of my fathers for a clean ledger," he says. Grant's voice hardens. "I ask you to save yourself from prison, and to save your people from starvation." Faced with the choice between honor and survival, Manoah's hand trembles as he reaches for the quill. It's not greed that moves him. It's the terrifying exhaustion of a man with no other options. The bribe wasn't just gold. It was the illusion of escape. While Grant uses debt to buy signatures, a more direct form of coercion unfolds in the main camp. Apithel tries to rally resistance, shouting to the crowd, "Do not touch the pen." They promised the Choctaw safety, and now the Choctaw bones bleach in the Arkansas swamps. But then the state militia rides in. These aren't federal troops. They're local volunteers, fueled by hate. They fire their muskets into the air, terrorizing women and children. General Grant steps forward and delivers his ultimatum. "The president has washed his hands of you," he announces. "If you do not sign this treaty, the federal protections will be withdrawn tomorrow." He points to the militia. "You will be subject to their laws. They can take your farms. They can imprison your leaders. You have two choices: sign and leave with dignity, or stay and be destroyed." The defiance drains from the faces of the people, replaced by pure terror. This isn't a negotiation. It's an ultimatum with a gun to their heads. The final day of the council is somber. The Treaty of Cession lies on the table, a document that promises individual farms for those who stay and removal for those who go. On paper, it sounds fair, but everyone knows the promises are lies. One by one, the chiefs come forward. Some, bribed, sign in shame. Others, coerced, sign with tears streaming down their faces. When it's Apithel's turn, he tells Grant, "This paper is a lie." Grant simply replies, "Sign or watch your nephew starve." Looking at the fear in his nephew's eyes, Apithel realizes that his own martyrdom will save no one. With a hand that feels like it belongs to a dead man, he scratches his mark, an X that looks like a scar. As the chiefs sign, the land speculators cheer, already carving up the map before the ink is even dry. 6 months later, the truth becomes painfully clear. The treaty's promises have vanished. The individual land allotments are stolen through fraud and forged contracts. General Grant has been promoted for his success. Apithel stands by the river, watching his people being loaded onto steamboats. He sees the great warrior Manoah, now old and broken. His bribe bought him nothing but a ticket to exile. Apithel looks at the X marks on his copy of the treaty, the signatures of despair from men squeezed between starvation and the sword. He crumbles the paper and throws it into the river, turning his back on his home to step onto the trail of tears. This process of treaty making was a template for removal, but the story didn't end with a signature. What happened when the deadline for voluntary removal passed? Let's shift to May 1838 in the Cherokee Nation of Georgia. Imagine being Alani, a Cherokee woman weaving a blanket, trying to ignore the rumors that the army is coming. Her husband sharpens an axe, not for war, but for the harvest, both of them clinging to a fragile hope that their government won't evict them from their homes. But then they hear it a low rumble, the sound of thousands of horseshoes and clattering swords. The pretense is over. The army has arrived. The operation, led by General Wingfield Scott, was brutally efficient. 7,000 soldiers were deployed to round up 17,000 Cherokee, men, women, and children. Soldiers burst into homes, giving families just moments to gather what they could carry. People were dragged from their fields, their dinner tables, their beds. One survivor later recalled how his family was forced to leave their breakfast simmering on the fire, never to return. The soldiers showed little compassion, looting homes for anything of value: money, silverware, even precious family heirlooms. This wasn't just an eviction. It was a violent robbery sanctioned by the state. The roundups were swift and terrifying, designed to prevent any organized resistance. Once captured, the Cherokee were herded into makeshift prisons called stockades. These were concentration camps, hastily built and horrifically unsanitary. Fort Himbree in North Carolina was one of the first. Imagine being forced into a crowded pen with hundreds of others, with no clean water, no sanitation, and barely any food. Diseases like measles and whooping cough spread like wildfire. A Georgia volunteer, who later became a colonel in the Confederate Army, wrote, "I fought through the Civil War and have seen men shot to pieces and slaughtered by thousands, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew. In these camps, people weren't just imprisoned, they were left to rot. The summer heat was unbearable, and the conditions were a death sentence for the very young and the very old. For weeks, the Cherokee languished in these stockades. The Army wasn't prepared for the logistics of feeding and caring for so many people. The promised supplies rarely arrived. The water sources became contaminated, leading to dysentery and other illnesses. At the Ross's Landing stockade, over a dozen people died each day. General Scott, focused solely on the military objective of removal, ignored the unfolding humanitarian crisis. This period of internment was designed to break the will of the Cherokee people, to make the coming journey, no matter how terrible, seem like an escape. It was a calculated campaign of psychological and physical torment. The signatures on the treaties, extracted through bribery and threats, had now led to this. Families torn apart, homes looted, and a proud people reduced to prisoners in their own land. The stockades were the final, brutal step before the infamous Trail of Tears, a death march where thousands more would perish from disease, starvation, and exposure. This wasn't just a policy. It was an atrocity, methodically planned and executed. The story of the treaties and the roundups serves as a powerful reminder of how easily the language of law can be twisted to justify profound injustice. Thank you for watching and for taking the time to remember this difficult history. If you found this video informative, please give it a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. The soldiers were told to be humane, but the real order was to be instant. For 19-year-old Private Jacob Miller, this wasn't defending the border. It was invading farmhouses. His sergeant, Silas Thorne, spat tobacco juice on the ground. "Sweep the valley," he shouted. "Every man, woman, and child. If they resist, burn the roof." They found Ilani's cabin, a peaceful home that looked just like Jacob's own in Pennsylvania. Thorne kicked open the gate. "By order of the president, you are to vacate this property immediately." Ilani stood in the doorway, her 2 children behind her. "We are waiting for word from Chief Ross," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "We have rights." Thorne smashed the butt of his musket into the doorframe. "In Georgia, you have 5 minutes to gather what you can carry." "Move," panic erupted. Jacob tried to be gentle. "Ma'am, please, just take blankets, take food." Ilani scrambled, grabbing a sack, the family Bible, cornmeal. But 5 minutes is nothing when you're losing a lifetime. "Time's up," Thorne roared. Soldiers dragged her husband, Sequoia, into the yard. "My loom!" Ilani cried, reaching for an unfinished blanket. "Leave it," Thorne ordered, hauling her away. As they were herded toward the road, Eleni looked back. She saw rough-looking men, squatters, running into her home. One of them sat at her kitchen table and started eating the breakfast she had made for her children. It was a total violation. They weren't just losing their land. They were being erased from it. The road to the stockade was a river of human misery. Ilani walked, holding her daughter Tylai's hand, while Sequoia carried their son Wea. They were joined by thousands of other Cherokee wealthy planters, traditional hunters, old women, and lost, crying children. The Georgia heat was suffocating. Dust coated everyone's throats. Jacob Miller walked beside them, a sickness rising in his stomach. This wasn't war. It was a roundup. An elderly woman collapsed. "Get her up," Sergeant Thorne commanded from his horse. "She's dead, Sergeant," Jacob said, kneeling beside her. Thorne's face was unreadable. "Leave her. The wagons will get the bodies. Keep the column moving." Eleni saw it all. "Do not stop," she whispered fiercely to her husband. "If we stop, we become dust." They called them forts, but they were cattle pens. The stockade was a vast, open-air prison enclosed by high wooden walls. The moment they were shoved through the gates, the smell hit them, a foul mix of human waste, rotting food, and pure fear. They slept on bare ground, exposed to the elements. When it rained, the entire enclosure turned into a pit of mud and filth. Rations were sporadic, sometimes barrels of salt pork thrown over the walls, sometimes nothing but weevil-infested flour. The proud Cherokee warriors sat with their heads in their hands, defeated. Women tried to create privacy with blankets, but the humiliation was constant. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter, some looking away in shame, others jeering. Soon, dysentery swept through the camp. The sound of coughing became a constant, haunting chorus. One night, Elani's son Weah woke with a burning fever. "Water," he whimpered. The water barrel was empty, scum lining the bottom. Eleni begged a guard at the gate. "Please, my son is burning." The young guard looked around and quickly passed his own canteen through the bars. "Take it and hide it." The water cooled Weah's lips, but the fever held on. Weeks turned into a miserable eternity. The logistics for the removal were a disaster. There weren't enough boats. A drought had lowered the rivers. So they waited in the filth as summer blazed. Sequoia grew quiet, staring at the walls. "They have taken our land, our guns, our dignity," he said one evening, his voice breaking. "I saw Red Bird, the medicine man, fighting a dog for a piece of pork rind. We are not Cherokee in here. We are animals." Elani grabbed his face. "No," she insisted. "We are Cherokee in the heart. That is the one place their bayonets cannot reach. We will survive this." When the order finally came to move, it was chaos. Families were torn apart in the crush. Sergeant Thorne rode through the crowd, swinging his crop. "Move! You'll see him at the river. Or in Arkansas. Just move." It was a lie. Many families separated in the stockades would never be reunited. As Elani's group marched out, she looked back. Smoke was rising from her old chimney. A squatter was living her life. The roundup was over. The stockade was behind them. Now, the trail of tears lay ahead. It began with a lie. When Elani's group was released in October, the autumn sun was warm. For a moment, there was relief. They were no longer caged. But the elders knew better. An old medicine man named Sia sniffed the wind. "The north wind is sharpening his knife," he whispered. Soon, the sun vanished. The sky turned to iron and the temperature plummeted. The trail had begun. First came the cold, relentless rain, turning the road into a slurry of freezing mud. Then, the mud froze into jagged, sharp ridges. Elani carried her son, Weah, who was weakened by a persistent cough. Her daughter, Talai, held onto her skirt. "My feet hurt, Mama," the little girl whimpered. Her shoes were gone, her feet wrapped in freezing rags. Elani looked down and saw the snow around Talai's feet wasn't white. It was stained pink. They were leaving a trail of bloody footprints on the frozen earth. Private Jacob Miller, riding alongside, felt a physical pain in his gut. He pulled off a pair of extra wool socks from his saddlebag and tossed them to Elani. "Put them on the girl," he said gruffly. Sequoia bristled at the charity, but Elani accepted. "Pride will not keep her toes," she said. That night, they slept on the frozen ground. Old Sia, who had given his blanket to a pregnant woman, froze to death sitting up, facing the home he'd never see again. They couldn't dig a grave in the frozen earth. They covered him with rocks and moved on. To stop was to die. They reached the Ohio River, a churning nightmare of black water and massive chunks of grinding ice. The ferryman doubled the price. "Hazard pay," he shouted. It took days to cross. When it was Elani's turn, the ferry lurched, its deck slick with ice. Midway across, a huge ice floe slammed into the hull. The boat tipped violently. People screamed. Elani threw one arm around a post, the other around her son, while Sequoia grabbed Talai just before she slid toward the dark water. When they finally reached the Illinois shore, Elani collapsed, but there was no relief. Locals followed the column, not to help, but to profit from their suffering. "Whiskey, $1, one man yelled. Another tried to buy the quilt wrapped around Elani's sick son. "You'll drop it when you die anyway?" he sneered. "I'll pick it up then." The river, the cold, and now the cruelty of men. The journey westward was a descent into an ever-deepening hell.
Doctor Caleb Satterfield had to hold the ink bottle against the pulse of his neck just to keep the black liquid from freezing solid. He sat in his medical wagon, the air thick with the smell of rot and unwashed bodies. By the dim light of a tallow candle, he opened the leather-bound logbook provided by the War Department. Title: Medical Report of Detachment 11. Total souls at departure: 1,029. He dipped his pen. Day 84. He wrote, deaths today, 14. Causes: dysentery, exposure, malnutrition. Total deaths to date, 142. He stared at the number .142. It was so neat and clean on the page. It didn't scream. It didn't show the face of a 3-year-old girl whose lungs had filled with fluid until she drowned in the open air. It didn't show the grandfather who simply sat down in the snow and refused to move until the frost took him. Bradley County, Satterfield was a man of excavator operator. He believed on a tight schedule, but on this trail, digging into the red clay banks of the Hiwassee River, only the statistics of Amazon fulfillment center subtraction problem that never seemed to end. The hunger didn't start. The machine hit something. There was no food. It's not a started because of greed. Unmistakable ivory white government hired private contractors. He kills the engine. Traveling Cherokee that follows feels ancient. Man who rode and warm down and sees more. 14 cents per day for each person. Likely a child. They spend only 8 cents. A rusted iron pot and a single blue tray bead. A Cherokee his boss man runs over. Stood in the ration line. The winter wind cutting through his operator just like a knife. He held out his hat. The agent shoveled the manager glances at the bones that was supposed to be the blueprints for the parking lot. It was grit husk and mill flow calculation mixed with dirt. One that has been made for centuries in America. Sequoia said, "Stop in the future. His voice rasped. Cover it up. Not for people." He hisses. The agent spat back. The coroner, take it. They'll shut us down for months. The meat was even worse. The operator refuses. Salt pork that was slimy and gray. He says, like the army surplus rejected years ago. But it's too late. A local hiker on a nearby ridge saw the whole grid in melted snow. She had her phone out. He made a thin, watery photo that offered no heat by no strength. The Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma their daughter been notified. The shadow girl took a spoonful and just stretched across the centuries to touch the present. It is a reckoning, has begun. Said, hundreds of miles away, but we must eat the earth to walk Oklahoma. On. The starvation Sarah Echola is at her desk. Mathematical erosion courthouse. A healthy person needs about 2,500 She's the Attorney General for the nation. 10 miles in the snow. Woman of sharp angles. They were getting less than 500. Their bodies began to consume themselves. Around her neck hangs a silver gorget. The symbol of her rank and her lineage. Once broad-shouldered, she is the great dash granddaughter of survivors. When an ox pulling her wagon collapsed from starvation, the principal chief. It was a moment of savage mass grave in Tennessee. The people would descend on the carcass near the old rattlesnake spring stock in sight. Frozen meat. A construction crew tried to bulldoze cracking bones to suck the marrow. Familiar anger rises in Satterfield noted it in his ledger. On the next flight, cannibalization of transport animals. The chief warns her the sick will now have the bones. Death rate will double. The governor of Tennessee, starvation weakened the fortress of the body. Disease stormed the gates. The camps were crowded and unsanitary. People drank from puddles where animals had defecated. The first killer was whooping cough. At night, the camp sounded like a hospital ward, filled with a terrifying, hacking sound as children fought for every breath. Then came the bloody flux of dysentery. It stripped a person of their fluids, their strength, and finally, their dignity. Chief White Path, an elder who had once negotiated treaties with presidents, fell ill. Within 2 days, he lay on a pile of pine boughs, too weak to move. "Leave me," he whispered to Doctor Satterfield. Do not let the young one see me like this. He died an hour later. The doctor had no medicine left to give him, only water. The lack of shoes made everything worse. Frostbite led to gangrene. Satterfield recorded the horror. Patient, adult male, frostbite on both feet, toes black and necrotic. No surgical instruments. He says available. We have no jurisdiction over land. We left 200 years ago. Of suffering were
Sarah
not just
grabs
numbers.
Her briefcase.
They were the smell of gangrene in a she corrects him. We were removed, and the Treaty of New Echota, when her own body had stopped producing milk, the sanctity of our dead climbed. I'm going to remind America of its impossible labor. Sarah is flying frozen with a bow inches deep. Digging a single grave took 3 graves for hours they didn't have. They began to lay the dead in shallow depressions. The battlefield covering them with leaves and stones no longer fought in the snow. But one night, courtrooms, Milani lay awake and heard the snarling. When Sarah arrives at the construction site, the wolves were digging up the graves. Police tape flutters in the wind. Who believed the proper burial was essential for North Carolina's journey. This was a torture worse than the cold itself. In January of 1839, crew they reached a stretch of Illinois prairie. Sarah walked straight to the sheriff. Just an endless expanse of snow, representing the Cherokee Nation. The wind howled. You are standing on a crime scene. We cannot stop. The conductor shouted, Miller, there is no wood, his arms, but the oxen this is private no further. They collapsed. These developers bought this land fair in a white void. You cannot buy a cemetery. Panic set in. Sarah replies fire. The night certainly cannot buy a crime scene. Alani looked at their wagon to the disturbed wagon bed. Those people didn't die of old age. They died of exposure. We need the wagon for the food. While being held prisoner, if we die tonight, States Army we do not need food. Alani is a federal historic site. Grab his disturbing it as a felony. Down the line, the developer families were tearing apart the very wagons that carried their lives. Look, they smashed heirloom chairs. But it was 200 years ago. That would burn. We're building jobs here. Small. You want us to stop the economy for a few bones? One of the soldiers is the moment sat shivering near his horse. He saw Alani's family and walked over, carrying his saddle blanket. May I sit? He asked, his teeth chattering. Sequoia looked at the soldier. He didn't see an enforcer. He saw a boy, terrified and freezing. He nodded. Why? Miller asked into the firelight. Why does the president do this? Sequoia stared into the flames. Because he looks at the land and sees gold. We look at the land and see our mother. You cannot buy a mother, and you cannot sell her. So he had to kill us to take her. That night, the temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. In the morning, the fires were ash, and the snow was dotted with mounds that did not move. 22 people died on the night of no fire. They were left in the snow because the ground was too hard to break. Late that January, they reached the mighty Mississippi River, the final barrier, but it was choked with massive ice floes. The ferries couldn't run. They were trapped on the east bank, and behind them, thousands more Cherokee were piling up, creating a bottleneck of suffering. For 3 weeks, they waited in a camp of misery. Those 3 weeks were the deadliest of the entire trail. Food ran out. The dysentery returned with a vengeance. Ilani's son, Weah, grew silent. He burned with fever, then shivered with chills. Ilani held him, rocking and singing low songs about the warm, southern Georgia hills. Mama, Weah whispered one night, is the new home warm? Yes. The cameras are rolling. Ilani lied. Sarah turns to him, tears freezing on her voice carrying to the crowd. It is always summer. It is not the past. I want to go there. She says. Weah said. You say get over it. His eyes. You are standing on the rib cage of a child. Ilani had no breath left by policy. She was building a warehouse on top of a genocide. America like a shallow grave in the frozen mud of the riverbank and wrapped Weah in a quilt. But every time you desecrate our graves, Miller stood at a distance, committing the removing his cap again, knowing you are saying we do not matter. In February, she turns back to the sheriff. Finally broke. I have a federal injunction stopping this work. As the ferry carried them across the Mississippi, I will have every one of you arrested. The machine doesn't move. The fight has just moved to a new arena. She saw the grave of her son. Later, they were leaving him in Washington, D.C. I will remember the spot. Testified before the Senate Committee on Truth and Reconciliation. I will tell his story. The discovery when the boat hit the western shore of the new Indian Territory. It's about more than just welcoming party. It's about the entire American narrative. More cold. Across from her crossed, Senator James Sequoia stepped off the boat and picked up a handful of the new dark history. It was gritty and hate their country, not the red clay of home. The senator begins. He said, apologized we are still here. By March, we have named parks winter finally broke. Why must we keep reopening these wounds through the thawing? Why call it genocide? Sat by that's a heavy word. Outside it was a relocation they had built. Sarah leans she had lost the microphone. Her senator, she says, well, she kidnapped 16,000 citizens from Maryland, bark from a tree, them to California, singing a quiet, defiant song in Cherokee. Ilani reached into her bag and pulled out a few remaining threads of wool she had saved. She found the sticks and began to set up a small loom. She would weave again. She would weave the story of the ice, the river, the bloody footprints. The Trail of Tears had tried to wipe them from the earth. It had failed. Private Jacob Miller, his duty finished, rode back east. He left the army a month later, unable to bear the uniform, spending the rest of his life telling people what he saw. But Alani did not look east. She looked at the fire. "We begin again," she whispered, and in the silence of the new land, the Cherokee Nation began to rebuild. The story of the Trail of Tears is one of unimaginable loss, but it is also a story of survival and resilience. Thank you for watching and for remembering this vital part of our shared history. February 1839, the survivors stood on the banks of the Mississippi River. But this wasn't a river, it was a churning, violent mass of gray water and jagged ice. The convoy had stalled. They had completely run out of food. Silas Vane, the contractor in charge of their removal, rode up to Dr. Satterfield. Vane looked well-fed, his expensive coat a stark contrast to the starving people around him. "Doctor," Vane said, "why aren't they moving? Every day they sit here costs the government money." After months of watching people suffer, Dr. Satterfield finally snapped. He jumped down from his wagon, his boots crunching in the blood-stained snow. He grabbed Vane by his coat. "Look at them," he screamed. "Look at the statistics, you ghoul. We have lost 20% of the company. They aren't moving because they are dying." Vane shoved him away. "They move, or I stop the shipments completely. I won't pay for a standing army of corpses." The crossing began out of sheer terror of starvation. It was a massacre. The exposure to the open river, the freezing spray of the water, it finished off those who had been hanging on by a thread. Alani watched a woman drop her baby into the icy water. It wasn't an accident. The woman's hands were so frozen she simply lost the ability to grip. She tried to jump in after her child, but Sequoia held her back. "Gone," the woman wailed. "Gone to the water." When they reached the other side, Dr. Satterfield did a head count. At Cape Girardeau, 9 were lost during the crossing itself. 6 more died on the west bank within an hour of landing. The statistics were accelerating. The graph of death was now a vertical line. By March 1839, they finally arrived in Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. The land was bleak, windswept, and foreign. But the marching stopped. The detachment halted in a muddy field near what would become Tahlequah. The conductor, Richard Taylor, stood on a wagon, holding the original manifest, the list of names taken back in Georgia. "We must call the roll," Taylor said, his voice shaking, "to allocate the new lands." Dr. Satterfield stood nearby with his ledger. Taylor called a name, Crow. A weak voice answered, "Here." Running Deer. Silence. 2 feathers. Silence. Waya, Elani's son. Silence. Elani squeezed Sequoia's hand, starved them until the silence was louder than the wind, and then sold their homes to pay off the national debt. Would you call it a relocation? Taylor went down the room, falls dead. You ask why we reopened the Wound in Kentucky. She continued. Buried in Illinois. The Wound never closed. In the snow it is infected. When the roll call was finished, is visible. Doctor, when our women murdered at 10 times the national rate, started with 1,029 people. It is only 814 treaties are violated for oil pipeline deaths. It is visible. 1 in 5. Our children 20% of this group had been erased just about their near annihilation. You apply that rate to the entire Cherokee Nation. She holds up a textbook used in Tennessee school. The number is staggering. This book says over the Cherokees migrated west. 4,000 birds migrate. 4,000 stories people are forced at gunpoint. Until this country can look at its own shadow and say the word genocide, tears and snow. There is no reckoning. He walked over to the fire, only silence, where Alani was trying to boil water. Goes viral. He held out for the first time. Doctor, millions of Americans began to see the map of their country. Satterfield said, "Weeping open as a crime scene. I cannot keep the numbers. A year later, they are not back at Rattlesnake Springs. They are ghosts. Tennessee." He threw the ledger into the fire. The pages curled and didn't just stop the warehouse. The cold statistics of suffering vanished into smoke. It's a crisp autumn day, rising into the gray Oklahoma the roundups began in 1838. The paper burns. The army isn't here to drive them out. But we remember, the National Guard is here to salute. She heard her daughter, carrying small, Tolly, cedar boxes containing the remains found at the site. Alani counted softly, touching Tolly's head. 2. She touched Sequoia. 3. She touched her own heart. The government statistics recorded who had died. The hearts of the survivors recorded who would live to tell the story. This wasn't the end, but a new, brutal beginning. They had arrived in their new home in the West, but the struggle to create Indian Territory was just starting. The first thing Alani noticed was the color of the dirt. In Georgia, the earth was dark and fertile. Here, it was the color of dried blood, a stark, dusty red that stained everything it touched. The second thing was the wind. It didn't whisper, it howled, sweeping across the flat, open prairies with a grit that stung the eyes. Sequoia, her husband, looked thinner than she had ever seen him. The trail had carved hollows into his face. He stared out at the scrub oaks and the vast, empty sky. "This is it?" asked Tolly, their surviving daughter. "Where are the mountains?" "There are no mountains here, little one," Sequoia said quietly. "Only the sky." They were promised a paradise. What they found was a raw, untamed wilderness. It was a land of extreme weather-baking heat in summer, piercing ice in winter, and it wasn't empty. Other Cherokees, who had moved west years before, were already here. So were the Osage and other Plains tribes, who looked on these starving new arrivals with suspicion. Alani reached down and picked up a handful of the red dust. It felt alien, but she remembered the promise she made to her dead son. "We are still here. Unload the wagon," Alani said, her voice cutting through the wind. "If this is the home they gave us, we will make it ours." Arrival did not mean safety. It meant a different kind of war, a war against the elements and government neglect. The United States had promised subsistence rations for 1 year, but the corrupt network of contractors struck again. The beef that arrived was just scrawny, sick cattle. The flour was often hard with mold or moving with weevils. Private Jacob Miller, the soldier who had shown them kindness on the trail, stayed for a few weeks to help distribute supplies. He was appalled. He confronted the government agent, a man named Stokes. "This is criminal. These people just walked 1,000 miles. You give them rot and call it charity?" Stokes just shrugged. "They're lucky to get anything. Besides, they're supposed to be farmers. Let him farm. But farming takes time." The ground had to be cleared, and they had arrived late for the spring planting season. Sequoia worked like a man possessed, using a sharpened stick and a broken hoe to clear a patch of rocky ground. Alani gathered wild onions to supplement the rotten rations. They lived in a lean-to made of canvas and branches. When violent thunderstorms rolled in, they huddled together, soaked and shivering. The psychological toll was even heavier. At night, the camps were silent. There was no singing. The trauma of the trail lay over the settlements like a heavy blanket. Men who had been proud leaders just sat staring into the fire. Mothers woke up screaming, reaching for children buried hundreds of miles away. "We are ghosts," Sequoia whispered one night. "No," Alani said, sewing a patch on Otali's dress. "Ghosts fade. We are roots. We are digging in." But as they fought starvation, a political storm was brewing. The Cherokee Nation was now divided into 3 hostile factions. First, the old settlers, who had come west years ago and had their own government. Second, the Treaty Party, the minority group led by the Ridge family who had signed the illegal treaty that caused the removal. And third, the Ross Party, the vast majority who had resisted, survived the trail, and remained loyal to Chief John principal Ross. Chief, the tension was suffocating. The Treaty Party lived in farmhouses they had built years ago. They lined with slaves and livestock. Meanwhile, watches an elder survivors of the trail lived in mud and misery, into the earth. Looking at them with pure hatred. The blue bead they sold us. Pot beside Sequoia said, OCO, sharpening the elder axe, whispers to the bones. They signed the paper. Welcome that killed our son. Tears pricked and now they live like kings while we eat dirt. Is the reckoning. Alani saw it isn't about money or apologies. They were remembering it's about restoring humanity. The law of blood. The assertion if a man sells the tribal land without consent, the penalty is Sarah's young niece on June 22nd, 1839. Are they safe now? The Reckoning King. Sarah looks at the fence marking the new memorial site. They are safe. We bought the land back. Execution squads were moved again. Major Ridge, Sarah sits on her porch in Taliqua, was ambushed and shot from his government has appointed his son and healing John commission Ridge on Indian dragged from his bed in front of his wife and children. It's a start, 25 but the real victory is in the living. Her niece is playing stickball in the yard, saving his shouting in Cherokee. Was approached by men that was nearly eradicated. Is now on TikTok. They stabbed him and crushed his skull in the halls of Tomahawk. The population of the Cherokee spread like wildfire. Grown to over 400,000. Gallop past Alani's cabin shouting, "Engineers, the ridges are dead. Leaders, just as shadow of the trail is still there." Stood up, statistics, a grim poverty, satisfaction in the fight for water rights. But Alani felt the cold no longer covers the sun. This is not justice. The story she is no longer. This just the trail of new war. The new chapter is we are still here. Savages. Sarah picks up her pen. The army back. There's a Supreme Court brief to write. Elias the reckoning isn't finished. Survive the purge. It's a daily practice. He gathered the remaining Treaty Party members and vowed revenge. In their harsh new home, the ancestors are at peace. Survived the children are playing. The Cherokee Nation now stood on the brink of a bloody civil war. Burning brighter than ever. Thanks for watching. If you found this story powerful, if this story moved you, please like, subscribe, share, and share to help us hear more stories. Histories alive. Chaos threatened to swallow them whole. In the new Indian Territory, the Cherokee were a people fractured. The old settlers, who had arrived decades earlier, refused to be ruled by the newcomers. The Treaty Party, Those who had signed the removal treaty feared for their lives, and the United States Army watched from the border, an eagle waiting for its prey to weaken. It was Chief John Ross who stepped into the fire. A physically small man, he possessed an intellect of iron. He knew violence would be their end. They needed law, not bloodshed. He called a great council at the Illinois campgrounds, inviting everyone, old settlers, survivors of the trail, and even the terrified remnants of the treaty party. For weeks, they argued. Tempers ran hot. Guns were drawn. But Ross, with unending patience, pleaded for unity. "We are not three peoples," he declared, his voice raw with dust and emotion. "We are one fire. If we scatter the coals, we go cold and die. If we pile them together, we burn bright again." The great Sequoia was there. He listened to the complaints, the demands for justice, the cries for revenge. Slowly, the sheer logic of survival began to cut through the anger. On July 12, 1839, they drafted the Act of Union. It was a constitution merging the factions into a single, unified body, the Cherokee Nation. It established a government with a principal chief, a senate, and a council. It created courts and a police force, the Light Horsemen, to finally end the cycle of revenge killings. Sequoia returned home that night, exhausted but with a flicker of light in his eyes. "We have a government," he told his wife, Elani. "We are a nation again." They chose a site for their new capital, naming it TITTLE. Out of the red dust and the blood of assassination, a democracy was reborn in the wilderness. 5 years later, the land was transformed. Where there had been only tents and scrub oak, towns now stood. Driven by a desperate need to prove their civilization to the world that had cast them out, the Cherokee built with a feverish energy. Solid log cabins with glass windows replaced canvas shelters. Corn grew 6 feet high in cultivated fields. In TITTLE, a Supreme Court building was erected. Plans were drawn for a brick capital. The printing press had returned, and the Cherokee Advocate newspaper was publishing in both English and the Cherokee syllabary. A new generation was growing up not in flight, but in freedom. One afternoon, a 13-year-old girl named Tolly came running home, clutching a book. She had attended one of the 18 public schools the nation had built, a school system that was, in many ways, superior to those in neighboring states. "Look, Mama," she cried. "I can read it." Her mother, Elani, couldn't read English well, but she ran her fingers over the pages, a soft smile on her face. "They tried to make us ignorant," she whispered. "They failed." The Indian Territory was becoming a prosperous, self-governing republic. They had their own laws, their own economy, exporting cattle, salt, and grain. An uneasy peace held, a testament to their resilience. By 1850, the Oklahoma wind no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a neighbor. Elani, now 42, stood in the small family cemetery. One grave held Sequoia, his lungs finally succumbing to the damage from the trail years ago. Another was an empty marker for Weah, the son they had lost in the Mississippi mud. She looked over the valley, at the smoke rising from 100 chimneys, and heard the church bells of TITTLE. Her daughter Tolly, now a young woman, laughed as she rode across a field. They had done the impossible. They had taken a death sentence and turned it into a future. They carried the embers from their old council fire in Georgia all the way across the Trail of Tears, keeping them smoldering in clay pots. And with that fire, they had lit a new one in the west. Elani touched the red earth. It was no longer alien. It held her husband. It fed her daughter. "We are not from here," she whispered, "but we are of here now." This new home was not a gift. It was a conquest of the Cherokee spirit. They had built it not by forgetting the past, but by refusing to let the past destroy them. The sun set, painting the Oklahoma sky in brilliant shades of violet and gold. The long journey was over. The home was built. The nation lived. But this golden age would not last. It was murdered by the American Civil War. The war tore the Cherokee Nation apart once more. Some fought for the Union, some for the Confederacy. It was a brother against brother nightmare that left a third of their people dead and their prosperous farms burned to ash. Tolly, once the little girl on the trail, was now a grandmother, weeping as she watched the home of Chief John Ross burn to the ground. "They have burned the harvest." Grandmother, her grandson, Elias, said. "We are back in the mud." Tolly gripped his shoulder, the memory of ice and wolves still sharp in her mind. "Mud is where we grow," she said fiercely. "They burned the house. They did not burn the road. We rebuilt Dot again." The enemy, however, was changing. It was no longer just soldiers with guns, but politicians with paper. In Washington, Congress passed the Dawes Act, designed to break up the tribal lands. To get his allotment, Elias had to stand in line and have his blood quantum certified by a government bureaucrat. He watched as the Oklahoma land runs began, as white settlers raced to stake claims on land that had been guaranteed to his people. As long as the grass grows and the water runs. Then came the grafters. White guardians were assigned to manage the assets of those deemed incompetent, stealing the newfound oil wealth from under their feet. It was a massive, bureaucratic theft. They are carving us up like a carcass, Elias told his son, Sam. They want the tribe to vanish. The next attack came in the 1920s under the motto Kill the Indian, Save the Man. Sam was 10 when the government agent took him to a boarding school that looked more like a prison. The first thing they did was cut his long hair, a source of spiritual strength. The second, they took his name. You are Samuel now, the matron said. The third, they took his language. When Sam was caught whispering in Cherokee, a teacher forced a bar of lye soap into his mouth. Scrub the dirt out, she hissed. Speak American. The lie burned his tongue, but that night, under his covers, Sam whispered the words he was forbidden to speak, hiding the language in the deepest pocket of his mind. Then, the ultimate irony. In World War II, the same government that beat Sam for speaking Cherokee asked him to use it to save the world. As a code talker, Sam sat in a radio bunker in France, speaking his heathen tongue. The enemy intercepted the signals, but heard only gibberish. The language they tried to kill was now a weapon for freedom. After the war, the government tried a new tactic, relocation. They offered one-way bus tickets to cities, hoping to dissolve the tribes by scattering them. Sam's family moved to Los Angeles. His daughter, Maya, grew up on pavement, feeling a hunger for a home she'd never seen. But in the cities, an unexpected thing happened. Cherokees met Sioux. Navajos met Chippewas. They realized they were all fighting the same battle. The isolation didn't break them, it forged them into a movement. By the 1970s, Maya was a young woman in the heart of the Red Power movement. She stood on the deck of a boat crossing to Alcatraz Island, seized by Indians of all tribes. It was about visibility. They were no longer the vanishing Americans. They were on the evening news, marching in Washington, D.C., demanding their treaties be honored. We are not artifacts. Maya screamed. We are sovereign nations. The pressure worked. The government ended its termination policy. The Indian Self-Determination Act was passed, giving tribes the right to govern themselves once again. Which brings us to today. In a classroom in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, Maya's grandson, Leo, sits. The walls are covered in the Cherokee syllabary. The teacher speaks only in Cherokee. Leo stands and reads a story about the Trail of Tears in the language of the people who walked it. Outside, the Cherokee Nation is a modern economic and cultural powerhouse. They run hospitals, build roads, and fund scholarships. The Supreme Court has affirmed that their reservation was never disestablished. Half of Oklahoma is, legally, Indian country. Maya, now an elder, watches her grandson. She thinks of Alani carrying the fire, Tully with her bleeding feet, Elias losing the land, and her father Sam, who saved the language from a bar of soap. They tried to march them to death, starve them, legislate them, and beat the identity out of them. And yet, here's Leo, a Cherokee boy on Cherokee land, speaking Cherokee words. The school bell rings. Children run out to the playground, and their laughter rises into the blue Oklahoma sky. It is the sound of victory. Thanks for watching. Follow for more stories of resilience and survival.